Hey, Clayton, in Mark chapter 4, Jesus says that he speaks in parables so that people won't understand him. That's what it says in chapter 4, verse 12. I thought Jesus wanted people to understand. Isn't that what we're trying to do in order to reach people? This is a great question, okay? Mark chapter 4 confuses a lot of people. Jesus tells a parable in that, and after the parable, his disciples come to him and say, Jesus, why do you always speak in parables? Okay, and parables are stories that tell in kind of a symbolic way Jesus's point. And so they're like, well, why do you do this? And this is how Jesus answers. He told them, and he's just talking to the disciples here. He's not talking to the crowd. He told the disciples, he said, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. And you're like, what? Wait. You speak in parables so that they'll see but not understand? Otherwise, they turn to be forgiven? That seems like the opposite of what Jesus is doing because he's trying to seek and save the lost, right? So what's going on here, okay? A couple of assumptions help kind of steer us wrong here, okay? The first is this. We assume that the parables were obvious in context, like what they meant was obvious, okay? We read many parables and it makes sense to us because we know the whole story. So we know that Jesus died and rose again and ascended to heaven and started the church and will return and all of these things. We know that this is what's going on. So we know the story. But when Jesus first showed up, people didn't always get this stuff. He was explaining things to them and telling the story, and the story might seem like an obvious illustration to us, but they're scratching their head because all this stuff is new. They do not fully understand this. There are times when he says, I must die and rise again. He says it as plain as day. And they're like, what do you mean by that? What could possibly be the thing that you're talking about here? That's crazy. So there are lots of places where people don't understand Jesus because they don't understand it until he's been raised from the dead. And they look back and they say, oh, now it makes sense. Okay. So don't assume the parables are there because they're making it clear. Sometimes they're not actually clear. The second thing that makes it hard for us is we assume that Jesus's primary goal was to make it clear when in fact it was not, okay? Jesus was not trying to make things clear all the time. What he was trying to do was generate genuine engagement. He was trying to provoke certain reactions. He was trying to get people thinking and processing because that's more important than understanding with your head what's going on. You need to engage fully and say, I want this. I got to dig in. That's how the spiritual life works. If you say, oh, okay, that's a nice idea. Well, you haven't gotten there. What you need to say is, I need to know more. I need to understand. I need to dig. I need to bring it into myself and churn it around and understand it and really grapple with it. That's where real faith comes from. It's not just up here. It's something that you have wrestled with on the inside. And so let's talk about this passage in Mark here, okay? In Mark chapter 4, it's interesting because Jesus is currently in a phase of his ministry where he is trying to make sure the word about who he is doesn't get out too quickly. He's even telling people, like, if I do a miracle, don't tell anybody about what I did. Don't tell anybody. He actually doesn't tell anybody that he's the Messiah until halfway through the gospel. The rest of the time, he's like, look, keep it quiet, keep it quiet. Halfway through the gospel, he is alone with his disciples and he says, who do you think I am? And they say, we think you're the Messiah. And he says, that's right. And it's only until that point. But the rest of the time, he's trying to keep it quiet. Why? Part of it is because he is trying to control when the message gets him in trouble. Because if he lets the message out too fast, then the authorities are going to say, he thinks he's the king, he's got to be arrested and crucified, and his ministry ends not at the time that he wants it to, okay? So he's trying to control some of that. But also what he's doing is he is trying to sort out who is actually interested in his message and who's there for another reason. Okay, so there are crowds there, and they're just there because they want to see a miracle, or they're just there because they're hoping he's going to, hand out bread like he does every once in a while, or maybe his opponents are there and they're just trying to trap him in something. And so he's trying to put things out there in a way that those who are truly interested will lean in and engage, and those who are there for some other reason are going to be turned off and turned away. Okay, and this is one of the interesting themes in Mark. He says it's actually surprising who actually sees what's really going on. At the very end of the gospel, the only people who say, "Look, Jesus is the Son of God," are the demons, the narrator, and a Roman centurion. Okay, so you don't get any of the people you would expect to say Jesus is the Son of God saying it in Mark. You just get outsiders saying it. And so it's one of those things where it's like people don't always get what's going on. And so part of what Jesus is doing is trying to see who will actually respond to the message. And you get this in Mark chapter 4. In Mark chapter 4, he tells this parable about the soils. He talks about the gospel is like spreading seed on all these different kinds of soil. And the soils are like different people, right? Different human hearts. And on some soil, the seed finds, just rich soil, and it grows up and it bears a lot of fruit. That's what you want to see. But on other soil, it gets choked out by weeds, right? Like the cares and concerns of the world, or it gets snatched away by birds, which is the devil coming and taking it away. Or it has shallow soil, so it only springs up for a little while and then dies. It's kind of a shallow faith or whatever. And he's saying there are lots of different reactions to the gospel, and you should not be surprised that there are different reactions. But the thing is, we're looking for the good soil, but we're throwing it all over the place. But only certain people are going to respond with a heart response that leads to salvation. And so this is what's going on. Jesus is throwing out that seed, and part of what he's doing with the parables is saying the people are going to lean in and say, "What's this all about?" Those are the people whose hearts are probably good soil. And when he's doing this, he actually quotes from Isaiah chapter 6. So that whole thing about they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding, otherwise they might turn and be forgiven. That's a quote from Isaiah. And Isaiah was talking about, or God was talking to Isaiah about people in his day. In those days, that people were resisting God. They were not listening to his message. They were not following him. And so God was describing them, saying, look, they're like people who have all the organs they need. Like they've got eyes and they got ears, and they can see and sense things, but it's almost like it's just not getting through to them. It's almost as if they didn't have those senses, because they can see, but they don't get it. They can hear, but they don't understand. And so he's saying, this is what that generation is like. And Jesus is taking that quote and saying, it's just like that generation, just like Isaiah saw, right? You're being the same way. You can hear me. You can hear the story of the parable, but you're not responding. And so that's why when Jesus tells a parable, oftentimes he'll say, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Because he's saying, if you're the sort of person who really wants to know, who's really seeking the kingdom of God, you're going to lean in. And this parable isn't going to put you off. It's going to draw you in. But those of you who are not actually interested in this, you're going to bounce right off of it, and it's going to show. And this is still true today. There are lots of times when people will come through church, or people will hear a gospel presentation, or they'll run across something online about Jesus, and there are going to be some people who it might even surprise you who they are, but it might not have even been like the easiest, clearest gospel presentation, but it doesn't matter. They lean in because their heart is saying, I need this. I need something more. I need to know what this is. And there are other people, it doesn't matter how clear you make it. It just bounces. And there's a mystery of why that is. But in some ways, those stories, those parables of Jesus, what they do is they find which hearts are responsive and call for an engagement. Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.